So this is what we're making: large and double small jump rings, cable chain. Now you could do this with a single small jump ring, or you could just use large jump rings for the whole thing. But I quite like this one because of the fact that it lays nice and flat. So I'm using two different size mandrels for this chain, 4.5 and 2.5. Now, normally I like an aluminium mandrel because that way I can cut the jump rings on it, and you can see by the end it tortures this a bit, but it's sacrificial, so it doesn't really matter. But I needed a 2.5 millimeter diameter for my small jump rings, and if I don't have the proper manual, oftentimes I'll use a drill bit, the correct size. So this is 2.5. The only bad thing is this is hardened, so when you're trying to saw your jump rings, holding it on this, it'll dull your saw blade. So I just chuck it up so that the drill itself is inside the chuck and the smooth bit is on the outside. I'm not real sure how many of each jump ring I need, so I'm just going to make some as I go. So I'm not going to make a huge amount, but I'll make probably 15 or 20 each. I'm starting with a meter long piece of 1 millimeter diameter wire. And using this cordless drill is quite easy because you just stick the wire in, bend it 90 degrees. And when you get to the end, stop. And I just clip that off. Now, the fact that this is 1 millimeter wire, if you want to know how many jump rings you have, just measure it. So that is 24 millimeters long, which means that'll be 24 jump rings. Cool, huh? Put the wire in, bend it 90 degrees. And you just guide it with your fingers. So you can see I have my index finger resting on the mandrel, and then I'm just letting the wires slide between my thumb and second finger. So I'm doing about the same number of jump rings of the large ones. We don't want a huge coil because it just gets difficult to handle. So now it's just a matter of cutting our jump rings. Now, I always cut this bit off with my side cutters. Hold your finger on the end so that it doesn't jump around. We don't want it flying across the room. And same thing with the small ones. So we're ready to start sawing. I'm going to do my small ones first because we're going to cut them, bring the ends together so they're perfect, and solder them. So all of the small ones need to be soldered separately. Now this is just a wooden skewer like you use for cooking, for baking. And I'm using it because the drill bit that I was using for a mandrel is hardened. So put a little beeswax on your blade. I'm using a 4/0 blade. and then I just brace it against the bench peg, bench pin. I usually only do about 3 at a time, otherwise they end up being captured by your blade or rattling around on here, and if you leave them on here as you're sawing, you'll damage them. So we just want to do a few at a time. And go ahead and do the whole 24. So now we're going to use our parallel jaw pliers and close all of the jump rings. So we just push and wiggle. Look at it from the top, from the side. Make sure that it's completely closed, otherwise it won't solder. So close all of your small jump rings. Okay, all of our first batch of small jump rings is closed. And we're just going to put them on our charcoal block. And what I do is I put all of the joins up, or all of the joins one direction, so I don't have to search for it when I start soldering. I know it'll be on the top. So I've got all my joins up, and we need to flex them now. So mix up your flux, make sure the water is incorporated. And I just put the flux on the join. Do them all. And now we're going to put a small piece of hard solder at each spot. Now these cutters are 1.8 millimeters. And just use your flux brush to place them. And place it right on the join. Sometimes you'll have to hold it with your solder pick so that you don't push the jump ring around too much. All right, now we're ready to start soldering. And now these are small jump rings, so it can be a fairly small flame. And what I'm going to do is just heat this up. The solder will flow. Shift the jump ring away from the flux. Don't heat it too long, or the jump ring will melt, turn into a nice little ball. Don't try to force the solder to flow. So this one, the solder wasn't on the join, and if you try to force it, it'll just melt into a ball. So don't force it. We want to pickle all those so that we can see whether it's actually soldered or not. And I just use a piece of copper wire to put them all on. So this is the easy way. So now while those are pickling, we'll cut our big jump rings. And what I usually do is just push this down against the peg nice and tight. And saw a few at a time, as long as I can hold this easily. When I can't hold it anymore, then I put it on the mandrel to finish cutting it. So now we're going to start assembling the chain. So just grab a big jump ring, open it, put 2 of the small ones on. Close it until you have a perfect join. Take another big one. Two more small ones. And if your fingers work like mine, oftentimes you'll find tweezers work really well. So we have 2 more on, and we'll run the big one through the 2 small ones that are already on the other one. Close it. And the nicer you have the join, the easier it'll be to solder. Another big one. Two more small ones. Put that one through the other small ones. Close it. So now you can see what it's going to look like. So just continue, assemble the whole thing, then we'll go back and solder the big ones. So what we've done so far is about 1/3 of the chain. And now we'll hold each one of these big ones so that the joint's up on a third hand, and we'll solder that. And then that whole piece will be soldered, and then we'll do another section. So I have the joint up, and the jaws of my third hand are at the very bottom, completely away from the join. So I'm just going to cut a few pieces of hard solder. It's the same 1.8 cutters. I have a bigger set, but these are 3.5 millimeters. So a small amount of solder. Now what I do is I warm up the jump ring and flux it. Then, using a tungsten soldering pick, I heat it up until it's red, lower it down, touch the solder. It jumps into a ball and will stay on the pick. Then I put the pick behind the jump ring, heat it up, the solder will flow. And then I just keep my torch in my hand, grab the next jump ring with my tweezers, shift it up. And once these jump rings are a little bit warm, you can see the join quite easily. So once again, warm it, flux it. Another piece of solder. Done. So just continue until you get to the end. Watch your flame. Make sure that the flame is only going up and only touching the join of the top jump ring. If you make a mistake and you run your flame down, what will happen is this will solder, the chain will solder together, and we don't want to do that. So just continue to the end. Okay, all of these are soldered now. So we can go in the pickle, or we can just leave it, assemble the next batch, assemble the chain, solder, just continue to the end, and then pickle the whole thing at once. It doesn't really matter, you can pickle as you go. All right, we're close to the finish, so you can see I've got a decent amount of chain. Now I'm down to the last 6, but put a few extra single links on so that you have an adjustable chain. And we're going to make a hook. Normally I would use 1.2 wire for the hook, but I only have 1, so we'll use it. So we'll just file the end of our wire flat. You can just hold it in your fingers. And we know that our jump ring is 4.5, so I'll just set the calipers at 4.5, slide it down on my flat round pliers and on the round part until it's 4.5. I want it to match the loop, the jump ring. So that, and then about 14 millimeters long between your loop and the end. So I'm just going to treat this like a jump ring. Open it. Put it on the last jump ring. close it. So we'll solder that, solder our jump rings, and we'll be finished. All right, all the soldering is done, and we have the beginning of our hook. So I'm just going to hold that with the loop vertical, hold it over the end of my bench block, and just use my jeweler's hammer to hammer it half its thickness. Then we'll just round the end with our file. Swiss number 2 cut flat hand file. Then we'll just tidy that end with our 400 grade wet or dry paper. And then we'll hallmark it before we bend it. And we're going to bend it up with the loop out, and we'll bend this up over the back. So I'm going to just hallmark it and then use my flat round pliers and I'm putting it the 4.5 millimeter mark just because it makes it a little more aesthetically pleasing. Then we'll just put a little kick on the end to make it easier to get the jump ring in. And that's it. So we're ready to pickle and then polish. And you can see how easy it is to snap that jump ring in. So in the pickle. So we're out of the pickle, and in this case it's sodium bisulfate, and ready to go in the tumbler. And don't try to polish this on a polishing wheel, a buffing wheel, because it'll just catch and either break the chain or your fingers. So put it in a tumbler. So here's our bracelet out of the tumbler. It's a cable chain, but it's also a nice flat chain because of the small connecting jump rings. So this is 180 millimeters long, and that takes 54 small jump rings and 30 large jump rings.